Welcome you all. I'm Johannes Bauer. As you know, professor in the Department of Media and Information, also director of the Quello Center for Media and Information Policy. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome Professor Jasmine McNealy from the University of Florida. Jasmine is an associate professor in the Department of Telecommunication, which is housed in the College of Journalism and Communications at the University of Florida. She is interested in information, communication, technology, privacy, online media, and communities. And she has a very strong interest in influencing sort of the discourses in law and policy as they affect those issues. And it's probably a very timely topic, right? As privacy, concerns about data ethics take on a stronger and stronger role in our discussions about information policy, and there's increasing resistance against large digital platforms, particularly whose business model consists in the appropriation of data to a large degree. At least that's the perception that many people have, and the complicated issues to navigate. Jasmine has spearheaded policy issues for a long time. She still is the chair of the division for communications law and policy at the ICA. In fact, that's how we, I think, first met a few years ago. She will move on from that role later this year when Christopher Ali will take over that position in the division. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you to welcome you here in our seminar. Thank you for taking the time, and I'll turn it over to you. Please help me welcome Professor Jasmine McNealy from the University of Florida.
So thank you, Giannis, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be with you today. As a Midwestern girl, to be back in the Midwest is awesome. I know you came expecting someone with long, lush hair. It's been gone for a minute. I probably should stop allowing people to use that profile picture of me. I'm not trying to pull a bait and switch on you at all. It is actually me in that picture. But as I was introduced, I am interested in the law and the policy, but actually how people actually behave, people and organizations, as it relates to data. So data governance, privacy, however we're going to define that, surveillance, emerging media, emerging technology, things like artificial intelligence and facial recognition, but also things like autonomous vehicles, how they're used in obviously the communications professions, but also just deployed on people and communities. I'm particularly interested in understanding the impacts on vulnerable and marginalized communities. And so I've been working for the past couple of years with respect to that and in various capacities. So today I'm going to talk to you about this idea I have called sonic privacy. Now, here's the thing. I know that privacy, or the word privacy, is kind of fraught right now because there's so many different ideas about what privacy is and what it should be. Some people have for years now proclaimed the death of privacy. I don't agree with that at all. But I think it's important to discuss what it is we mean when we say privacy and the implications for it. So before I get deep into this, let me offer you some grounding where I'm coming from. Like what would be a lecture to PhD students without some groundings of things? This is what I'm working off of. So this is a modification of Bronfenbrenner's idea related to human development, but an ecological approach. So I use this ecological approach to data and data governance. And what I say is that like Bronfenbrenner's idea related to human development and how to study humans and how they develop and the implications for their growth and development, that there are 4 levels. I also say that that is really important to understand for data governance, and issues like surveillance and issues like privacy in this world that we live in. So this nested batch of circles, I think, is really important to understand. So there's a micro level, there's a meso level, there's an exo level, and a macro level. And at this micro level, this starting point, so to speak, is where the data is, or data resides. And to me, data is a personal thing. It is the person, but it is also the person's network. Your relatives, so your parents, your brothers and sisters, but also your network of people who can be identified through you. To give an old school example, so to speak, if you're on any kind of social media, particularly Facebook, you know that if you throw up a photo and you're in it, but also your friends are in it, there's an association that can be made about you and the connections, but they could be identified through those, either through people tagging them in comments, you tagging them actually on the photo, or Facebook saying, hey, do you want to tag so-and-so, right? Because Facebook has been trained to recognize certain kinds of people in photos now, right? So that's the micro level. It is a networked, data is networked individuals there. And then we move out to the meso level. And this is the community where data resides, or the people, people and community-based organizations, schools, right? Churches, right? Community-based organizations that influence data, how it's used, how people experience life in various ways. Move further out, we have institutions. Now, unlike the community kind of institutions, schools, the churches, these institutions I'm talking about are like foundational institutions that have played major roles in what happens with all of us and other organizations, whether those organizations are corporate or nonprofit or civil society organizations. So institutions like the courts, institutions like the legislators, institutions that are big and broad and have significant power, probably is the best word to use there. And then there's the macro level, right? So the macro level is about the different environments. And what I mean by environments, I mean like the legal environment, the economic environment, the social and cultural environments. Now, here's the thing about this ecological nested model. It is a model. And the problem is, you know, that I'm sure if you have any of you who do like health communication, environmental communication, you know that ecology is messy. So while this model looks good and helps us to explain, we know that actually what it would look like in practice is something really big and messy, and the micro level, or I'm sorry, the macro level would actually be flowing in and out and through all of these other levels, because it touches culture, touches everything. The legal system touches everything. The social and economic environments touch everything, right? So this allows us to look at this model and say that there are different things that are going to matter and do matter and make an impact on that micro level, that data, but it is not a full-on explication or full-on description, because ecology is dirty, messy. However, it does allow us to kind of understand what's happening here. And why does this matter? So I'm looking at this again, data, a networked representation or observation, because data can tell us so much about people, or at least it can be used to predict so much about people. So I have this picture as I was in China, and we're on these carts. So imagine data as you in a cart by yourself. But data is more than just you, always. it is hooked up. In this case, it's networked like these pods or spaces are. It's always moving, always flowing, and communicating some kind of thing. Or I should say, it can be used to communicate. It can be used to predict or make inferences about various topics. It's used to represent something. So why is this important? I come at this from Stuart Hall perspective on systems of representation, because for me, artificial intelligence, machine learning systems, decision systems that are being used all the time now and created and innovated, so to speak, are systems of representation. And according to Stuart Hall, he says, systems of representations or representation systems are different ways of organizing, clustering, arranging, and classifying concepts, and of establishing complex relationships between them. So why does this matter? This matters because representation then and representation systems places things in categories. Things like whether or not something is desirable or not. Things like whether you or I are predicted to make certain kinds of choices or end up certain kinds of places. Representations of us that are used then to make predictions about other people as well. And so when I talk about categorization, really classification, because I'm talking about institutional rules related to what people are or what organizations are or what communities are. It's about setting things that are alike or most alike together. And then it's about what to do with deviance. What if somebody or something doesn't meet a certain standard or isn't enough like a certain group? What do you do with that deviance? How is it handled? What kind of classification then is that person or community placed in? And these are questions for artificial intelligence and the creators of our artificial intelligence, but also for policymakers. So what do you do when a system is basically classifying or making predictions about individuals, particularly from specific communities, or making inferences related to, let's break it down even further to a more a more ubiquitous or perhaps recognizable example. What do you do when Netflix, which uses artificial intelligence, so to speak, machine learning to understand your, probably your preferences? What do you do when they only show you certain kinds of movies or certain kinds of thumbnails for movies based on predictions they've made about you? Does it matter? Or is that not enough? But what if we move that further into making predictions about whether or not you deserve a kidney, or whether or not you deserve to be treated rapidly when you're in the ICU, or whether or not you deserve to enter a university, whether or not you're going to make it if they allow you to enter that university, right? So these are all kinds of decisions that are made about people in and in representation systems, in artificial intelligence, in these decision systems that are deployed all over now, and increasingly are being used and adopted by governments, corporations, of course, but even civil society organizations are adopting data use / machine learning and decision systems to help them make decisions. And, we are slaves to efficiency. We aren't, though, unfortunately, as big as slaves to empathy and or accuracy, because we find out when things are inaccurate or are harmful after having implemented them, unfortunately, many of the times. And that's because certain kinds of assessments aren't required beforehand. So I say all that to say, that's the grounding of why I think we need to consider what are we doing about sonic or sound related data? Because that is another vector. It is another kind of network representation or observation that can be used to make inferences or predictions about people. And it is, or people at least are claiming, people and organizations are at least claiming they can make certain predictions about people based on sound and certainly identification of people. So let me give you 3 examples related to sonic privacy that have come out relatively recently in the past year and a half related to sound, sound uses, and the fear people have related to sound. So it's no shock to you that many people fear that they're being listened to by their technology. So both hardware and software, right? So a repeated worry of users of technology is that it's listening to them. So anecdotes about users speaking with a friend about a particular topic and then logging on to a site and, or using their devices and then seeing an advertisement, right? Related to that topic have peppered, obviously, news and networks. And while many scholars and journalists have denied that apps and some devices are constantly listening, the uneasiness remains and stories persist. So at the heart of these worries is a concern about constant surveillance and surreptitious data collection. And we are aware that data is valuable and the driver of various systems. And we also know that the aggregation of various kinds of data allows organizations to train algorithmic systems based on more extensive representations of data subjects. So let's look at a couple of examples, right? So this has to do with Alexa, many of you may be familiar with, and the dark side of voice assistants. And since, voice assistants and home voice assistants have become popular, one of the big questions is, what happens when you're just talking? Are they listening all the time? And the answer, for the most part, is maybe, or sometimes. There are certain trigger words that have been found, not just, hey, Alexa, but other words. We know that there have been actual cases where Alexa or the other voice assistants have recorded crimes happening and that data has been subpoenaed, those recordings. And it's not like the people committing the crimes called out to Alexa and said, hey, Alexa, please record this. It was recording at that time. Another kind of controversy happened when Google's Assistant was popularized, Google Assistant being able to call and make reservations for people. And so the question was, if you were on the other side of that and you didn't know that you were speaking with a robot, so to speak, what are your feelings or thoughts? What can you do? What are your rights related to being able to speak with a human and or not speaking with a robot? And also, is the robot recording your answers? And what are your rights to those answers? What are your rights to your voice in communicating with a robot? Do you have any? Or is the expectation that once you answer the phone, all bets are off? So that's another controversy. A third, a study that came out recently as well, is that it was about the fact that all of us have a unique bioacoustic signature. And so when there's uniqueness, it can be used to identify. So just like you've probably seen articles or news stories about gait analysis, like the way we walk can identify us to a certain extent, right? Of course, you can change how you walk, but for the most part, we have a pattern of walking and that can identify us. The same thing with our bio sounds, our bioacoustics, the way our heart beats, the sounds our bodies make, basically is like biometric data that can be used to identify you, kind of like a fingerprint, which of course is fraught with peril as well, we know, but, or an iris scan, right? So what do you do if a sensor of some kind is collecting bioacoustic data? What are your rights to that? What are your rights to not be captured? And I think the word is really important, capture. What are your rights to not be captured and then not to be processed, so to speak, in connection to your identity? These are questions that are, again, emerging because of the different vectors of data, the different kinds of data that are being made available, or I should say the datification of us, of our individual selves, but our communities as well, that are cause for concern. Now, here's the thing. People could say, oh, well, this would be another way to identify people. What if you're lost? What if kids are lost? Other kinds of emergency situations. And that's absolutely a concern. But the fact of the matter is, when we create systems like this, or identification systems like this, algorithmic systems, one of the major questions that always has to be asked is the good use going to be always the only use? The answer, most definitely, is always no. And if that is the case, then what then should we do about a system like that? And even if we say we have a good use, air quotes to good, is it good for everybody? Or are there ways that representation system, that classification, deals with deviance that has disparate negative impacts on certain people because they don't fit certain kinds of mold based on various vectors of identity? So socioeconomic, racial, language, religion, sexuality, gender, things that must be considered. And we know that we've not just heard stories, but there's actual studies about the fact that we live in various societies, I should say, where those identifiers play a significant role in what we experience during our lives. So what should happen when systems like this arise, particularly as it relates to sound data? Now, I told you in the beginning, we need to consider the idea of privacy, because privacy, that word, is so fraught. People don't know really what to do with it. What does it cover? When we say privacy, do we always mean the same thing? Of course not, we don't. Obviously, there are various ways to translate and define privacy based on experience, based on culture, based on expectations, right? But as it relates to law in the United States, we have a very piecemeal idea of what privacy is or should be. And as it relates to sound-related privacy, the interesting thing is we have to cobble together various kinds of cases or case law sectors to really consider what it is we mean when we say sound-related privacy. So here's an interesting thing. Sound-related privacy has traditionally been discussed in connection with, as far as academic fields or scholarly fields, in connection with construction or architectural design, where considerations about the transmission of sound is a significant concern, right? So you want to make a house that doesn't tell all your business for the most part, right? Or you want to be in an apartment where you don't hear what's going on in your neighbor's apartment next door or above you if they're running or having a dance party, whatever the case may be. But these studies consider analog or unmediated access to sound and an individual's rights or ability to refrain from encountering sound, and also organizational attempts at masking sound in employment and living context. This research considers, for example, the studies of the design of workspaces. Let me give you an example. A study by Kavanaugh and his colleagues focused on the development of a rating system for speech privacy, or privacy in relation to factors influencing how voices travel in modern buildings. And they found that speech was related more to how well those receiving sounds were able to understand what was being said instead of the level of noise. Also, traditional sound studies or sound privacy related studies relate to music. So let me give you another example. Automobile or car soundscapes. So a study found that car drivers played music to create sound-related privacy. Music, according to Bull and his colleagues, exercised the random sounds of the environment, but mediated the sounds of the cassette or radio. So cassette, obviously, this is a long ago study, it's 2001. Most of us aren't listening to cassettes anymore. Another study found that as it related to intimate listening, or the ability to hear the coital sounds of others, mediated the intimacy of couples. Though, like the other traditional studies related to sound and privacy, it's slightly different in that context. While most sound privacy studies related to people receiving sounds, a study by Gurney and colleagues explored the implications on individuals who may at some point be sound creators. And so this is important for the idea of a theory of sonic privacy, because it focuses on the rights of individuals related to the sounds they create, or the sound data that they create. But here's a problem. In US jurisprudence related to privacy, there's this public-private dichotomy that gets in the way of everything. And it has really complicated discourse surrounding privacy, particularly as it relates to technologically or mediated incursions into privacy. Because the usual statement is this: if you are in public, you have very little expectation of privacy in what you do and what you say. Just being in public kind of dilutes any kind of right you may have to privacy. But on the other hand, you have the greatest expectation of privacy when you're in your private home. So, but we don't spend all day in the house. So that kind of like makes it seem as though we have very little recourse if there are harms committed related to our privacy when we're out in public. That makes absolutely no sense. And actually, if we look at court cases related to sound and even related to this public-private dichotomy, we know that there are kind of nuance and contours that we have to consider related to how the court, even the US Supreme Court, have decided cases related to sound. So I look at the lessons from sound law. I know, I could go on talking about this for a long time. We don't have that much time, but happy to talk more with you in the Q&A section. But I want to talk about this. It's a case, I'm in this paper I'm writing, in the scholarship, I'm looking at a lot of cases related to technology and sound. And many of those cases deal with wiretapping and eavesdropping. And many of you all are at least in the College of Communication. And so you're familiar with perhaps some of the cases dealing with people or organizations and journalists getting sued for wiretapping and eavesdropping, or collecting sound and video as well, right? So here's an example case that demonstrates the complexity of ideas related to sound data and sound privacy. So this Zussman case is really interesting because Zussman, it was one of those ABC investigations related to a psychic, or like a psychic phone calling center. And a journalist got a job as a telephone psychic in a psychic call center, and they recorded the goings on of their coworkers, conversations they were having, all kinds of stuff, right? On the face, you would say, okay, based on previous cases, that coworker talking, or those coworkers talking out in the open where other people could hear with their naked ear, so to speak, should have very little expectation of privacy in their conversation. But that's not the case in Zussman. Actually, the court said that although that, in the state, there was no kind of intrusion related privacy unless a person proved that they had a reasonable expectation of privacy, that didn't mean that privacy had to be absolute or complete. According to the court, mass media videotaping or recording can constitute an intrusion even when the events in the communication recorded were visible and audible to some in a limited set of observers, or a limited set of observers at the time they occurred. So instead of requiring seclusion, absolute seclusion of people to have an expectation of privacy, you have to understand that seclusion is a relative term, right? And so even though an individual may not have an expectation of confidentiality, they can have a reasonable expectation of privacy with regard to a conversation, that it not be recorded. So it seems to me that the court is saying in these cases, in cases like it, when you introduce technology, it's different than the naked ear hearing. So you can kind of make the case, and I'm making the case in this paper, quite frankly, that when technology is added, when things are datafied, this goes beyond what the naked ear hears. You could call this a theory of hearing versus listening. So if I look at hearing as the recognition of sound, so you get an input from a sound from a source and an understanding of the noise, full stop. Listening, on the other hand, is more than simple recognition of sound. Instead, it is the processing of sound. That means the data is used for more. So it's not just about, okay, I heard something, whatever. It's about, I heard something, I recognized it, now I'm gonna do something with it. And that's the case, you introducing technology to understand sound about people, sound to make inferences or predictions about people. And that is of concern because, as I noted earlier, sound has so many identifying factors for people and for communities. So let me offer you a parting example before I close out. And that is the technology of ShotSpotter. So if you don't know what ShotSpotter is a technology, a surveillance tool that is touted as being able to recognize, distinguish gunshots, and then be able to alert law enforcement to where exactly in a geographic area those gunshots are happening based on sensor data, right? And so what does that mean? That means that there are certain communities that are surveilled based on sound. But how many of you know that most of those communities are also urban? And so how many of you know that in a city context, there are all kinds of sounds that are made that sound a whole lot like gunshots? So what happens when a certain area is categorized as a high-level activity based on the sound data predictions or inferences, when actually not all of those sounds are actually gunshots? What happens when predictions or inferences are made about certain communities, and then the people in those communities based on sound. And quite frankly, it's been found that ShotSpotter is not accurate. It's just not. And yet it has been deployed by law enforcement. So this is what I'm considering in this idea of sonic privacy. Can individuals and communities make assertions about the sound that they create, their expectations related to the sound that they create, the sound data that they create, that is deserving of protection through policy, through regulation? Happy to discuss this more in the Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks, Jasmine. And so a fascinating topic, and obviously an emerging topic where we know a lot of things are in flux and in movement. So the floor is open for questions. You can raise your hand from the participant menu or just speak up.
So Ruth in the chat says, the shooting of 13-year-old Adam Toledo, this is in Chicago, if any of you are paid attention to the news coming out of the Chicagoland area, following the police getting alerted by sound systems that shots had been fired. Yeah. I think you had your hand up? Yes.
Yeah, that was my question or comment. You know, this is so relevant. Thank you for what you shared. Really appreciated it. But you can see how, who's to say that that was a misfunction or, you know, just an alert, and the police go in already, you know, thinking there's a shootout going on, and shoot this poor child who has his hands up, who's running away because he's frightened, and then puts his hands up. It's just, this is so important because it's making, we're trusting technology to do things it's not prepared to do.
Yes.
And yeah, this is just so relevant. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So I see, Emily, you had your hands up. Please.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Johannes. Hi, Jasmine. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so much for coming and visiting us. My name is Emily Rader, and the focus of my research is usable privacy and security. So I spend a lot of time thinking about people's expectations for how their data will be used. And I used to teach a privacy class to undergraduates. And around the time I was teaching this class, there was a case that I read about that I talked about with my class. And I just wanted to ask you if you were familiar with it. So the case, I just Googled it. I can paste the link into the chat. It's Huff versus Spa. And basically what happened was this guy who's a CEO was on vacation, and he was talking with someone else about potentially firing someone that was on their board. But he didn't realize that he had butt dialed the secretary of the company. And the call was connected for like 90 minutes or something like that. And the secretary was taking notes, like she recorded this butt dial and she was taking notes the entire time. And then she was afraid after hearing the conversation that basically they were going to be discriminating against this person in terms of firing them. And so she reported what she had heard, and like the CEO got in all this trouble and there was this big lawsuit about it. And he basically was trying to have all of that stuff sort of eliminated and have the case thrown out because he didn't intend for her to overhear it, but he lost. And so I don't know if you were aware of it or if you had any thoughts about that. It seems really interesting to me that like he butt dialed her and his expectation was that she shouldn't have listened because he didn't intend to call her.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that case, and that's really great. It's funny, but not. But so it reminds me a little bit of Bartnicki versus Vopper. So Bartnicki case was a case where some anonymous person recorded a conversation, a phone conversation between like the head of a union and another person, a teachers union. There was a big like teachers union, teacher strike happening in Pennsylvania, a part of Pennsylvania. And I don't know how this person recorded it. It wasn't either the people involved in the conversation, because there were statements about blowing off porches of people. So obviously they didn't want to record that. But, and then the recording was placed in the mailbox of a journalist, a radio journalist, who then played the recording on. And that journalist was sued. And the Supreme Court said, you know, if the journalist had been involved in surreptitiously recording, or involved in the actual use of, ideas, the use of the technology to get that information, then maybe they could be in trouble. Other than that, the First Amendment protects them. So in this case, without having read it, it would seem like there would be some nuance in the fact that she didn't call him. She was called, even though accidentally. And I guess the question would be about what are her duties related to hearing or listening to sound? I can't answer that. I'm totally gonna go and read that case. It's totally interesting. But yeah, so these are the kinds of questions that arise related to what do you do with sound and sound data, and particularly as it deals with really, not that everything's not important, but really important issues like what you mentioned. Yeah, thank you for putting that on my radar. That's awesome.
So Teresa, Professor Teresa Maston had her hands up, and then Apurva sort of posted a question in the chat, but let's do it in that order maybe. Teresa.
Okay, hi Jasmine, nice to meet you, and I really appreciate your presentation. And I'm not really familiar with this area. Could you speak a little bit from a policy perspective, the two sides that are signing up to support the opposite perspectives?
Are you asking like the side of not regulating this kind of area? Yeah. So the side of not regulating is saying that, you know, look, data is useful. Data helps us make decisions, particularly from a government standpoint or a civic data standpoint. The data that can be collected can help us make decisions about quality, traffic, environmental or toxicity issues, even decisions about, and this is controversial too, people's mood and how that can help, you know, sentiment analysis using data, basic sound data, right? Make these decisions that presumably can be for good, right? Or to make our product better, or to allow us to provide better services. So that's the other side, is saying like, wait a minute, this data is useful. And also it's not personal, right? It's not personal. You know, we're not trying to identify people using it, depending on what kind of data it is that they're collecting. It'll just be an aggregation of all kinds of data to use. And so it's not personal. The problem is that we found that LaTanya Sweeney has done research in this area, and she's found you only need like 2 pieces of data to re-identify somebody on a personal level. So there's a very high risk related to even sound data, even sonic data, right? And also the question is, do you need all this data to make better civic decisions? Do you need all this data to know that you've had traffic on this main street for a very long time and you still haven't widened it, or you still haven't made, rearranged the routes, but you need more data to understand that, even though you've gotten complaints for decades? So these are questions that basically there's pushback on either side. One about efficiency, one about services, and the other about people and communities that could be harmed.
Thank you.
Thank you. So in the chat, you talked about the listening and the hearing seem conceptually different from your assessment example. I wonder if that is because we feel like our perceptions or expectations of privacy are violated because we equate listening to surveillance? Probably, I would agree with that statement. Listening, so surveillance is watching, so to speak, to make decisions. Let me give you an example. We do surveillance, and we've done surveillance, both analog for a long time for the CDC, and now using supposedly apps related to COVID, right? So surveillance is, we want to make sure we stop something or nip it in the bud, right? And to trace the possible ways it could spread so we can, again, stop it. So surveillance is observation to make an intervention. And the problem is the surveillance interventions that are made a lot of times are not necessarily positive interventions, right? They're not all like, how do we get people vaccinated? How do we make sure people aren't interacting? Or how do we make sure that people quarantine themselves? These are surveillance interventions like, who needs to go to jail? Who needs to, be surveilled because they're likely to commit some kind of crime, right? And these are inferences or predictions being made about people, unfortunately, in a system that we know has bias, and bias doesn't even cover it. There's racist systems, there's homophobic systems, there's anti-religious or religious discriminatory systems, like you name it. And so that's our problem. You don't get rid of those very real issues in the environment just by saying, let's use technology. So I think that's really important to consider. Yeah, absolutely. Celine?
Yeah, fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. This was very eye-opening. And my question is mostly related to, future potential scenarios of that span different areas of privacy, vis-a-vis regulating things related to private data of users and consumers. Within those discussions and different scenarios, there are some futuristic thinking that it's going to further create inequities of the haves and have-nots in terms of controlling their own privacy. So how do you balance that out with the sonic privacy, but also the uniqueness of different communities and how accuracy of these voice detection and analysis software that are often created by individuals within the dominant group and do not yield that much good accuracy for individuals from certain sociocultural backgrounds and as you mentioned, vectors of identity that might be peculiar or specific to certain groups.
Yeah. So I think a usual and unfortunate response to that is that, there needs to be more representation, the hiring of specific people from specific communities. I don't agree with that. Because if you hire someone into a system when they have no power, it is worthless. You just have, a person you can trot out and say, look, we have representation. It means nothing. What I would say is that there has to be infrastructure for actual power for people in specific communities that are marginalized and or vulnerable. And that means that organizations have to come to those communities and get not consent, but they have to get buy-in and they have to get permission and they have to use the infrastructure that the community has made. So I see the example of this is there's quite a lot of movements related to indigenous data sovereignty, which says that, look, we as specific groups have specific regulations or guidelines that you have to meet. And if you're not meeting those, guess what? Don't even bother trying to use the specific information or get that specific data that you want to from us. I think that kind of infrastructure, so to speak, regulatory infrastructure, is the way to go because it allows for specific communities to decide for themselves, one, whether they want to participate, and two, it rearranges the power dynamics between really powerful organizations, corporations, governments even, and that community or individuals in that community. Cool.
So Sheena is next. And then we had a couple of questions in the chat also, but Sheena.
Yeah, hi. I guess I have maybe a mini question and then a more real question. But I, as a child development scholar, I really liked your adaptation of Bronfenbrenner, and that I felt like that really resonated with me. I was able to really, catch on to what you were talking about as someone who's not so familiar with privacy. So I wanted to say I enjoyed that and was curious: have you coined that model yet? Can we refer to it?
Yeah, so I call it an ecological approach to data governance. It's under review.
Great. Yeah.
Your guess is as good as mine is.
Sure. But hopefully soon we'll be able to cite it. Yeah, that's exciting. That was my mini question. And then similar to, I think, some others, just kind of trying to understand where things are right now, I guess. So I loved the kind of the example you gave us at the end, where it looked like, the law did err on the side of, technology adding a layer of, right, something like that, added a layer of that, making it not okay, right? That it's different from what the naked ear is hearing. And I guess I'm curious would you say that's the standard? That's where we're seeing that's the side that we're seeing law drawn on, or is it more on the other side, or is it like a completely mixed bag as far as kind of, the majority of these types of cases that we've seen so far?
Yeah, so great question. It is a mixed bag. Even in this, I would say, especially at the Supreme Court, where they haven't made a really, I would say, blockbuster ruling related to this. Of course, there are a couple of justices, on the US Supreme Court that have said, look, what is happening, we need to really reassess, particularly that public-private dichotomy. Also, there's I don't want to get too into the weeds, but there's a phrase or a term called mosaic theory. And mosaic theory said there's all these kinds of vectors that can be used to surveil people and to collect information on them. We need to really consider what is happening. But yeah, there's a mixed bag because many of these cases go through state courts. States do whatever they want. They don't necessarily listen to each other. The example I gave to you all, the Sussman case, was California, which has a lot of these cases just because it's so big, but also because of various other factors. So it's a mixed bag. What we have to have in the United States would be like an omnibus federal data protection / privacy law. We still don't have that. So yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm watching the time here, so we have a few minutes left. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Linda is going to ask hers or make a comment in person, but before we do this, Samantha was curious to hear your comments on whether there are sort of older technologies. I'm trying to paraphrase, and hopefully I'm not too much off. Where there's sort of cases that we can use kind of as guardrails or as guidelines for these emerging sonic privacy cases. I mean, so probably one of the features of common law in the United States that we look at past cases, right, as precedent for current issues, and sometimes those precedents are enabling, sometimes they're very constraining.
Yeah. So I would say to a certain extent, yes. So sound law cases I've been looking at are those wiretapping and eavesdropping cases, which are old school tape recorder or hidden camera, those. Also looking at, the Cats case is probably the bedrock of privacy jurisprudence in the United States, or changed it anyway. And that was a telephone booth. We don't have those anymore, unfortunately, or fortunately, but the telephone booth. And whether or not he had an expectation of privacy in using a public telephone booth when he closed the door. And so that kind of question. So there are some old school ones, but you have to, or I had to kind of think of like what all the sound or aural privacy mean? Like, and how many of those can, or how many different directions can we go? I would also say the kind of nuisance cases related to sound, like calling the police on your neighbor for being too loud cases, those as well. I think Linda was next.
Yeah, Linda.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Jasmine. Great, wonderful information. Thank you so much. So I was a reporter in Birmingham working at the NBC, and when ShotSpotter was deployed there. And so, you know, many conversations were the mindset of this is not just a way to help police get to the scene of the crime easily or faster, but it could also, you know, be a deterrent. And you know, certainly at the time, residents and neighborhoods welcomed it because they were tired of, you know, shots fired. And Birmingham is notorious, the South, notorious for firing their guns on July 4th, every holiday, right? You know, watch where you're looking. Anecdotally, you know, children have been killed by stray bullets coming back down out of the sky, so, or injured. So in this instance, I say to you that it wasn't necessarily a negative. It's seen as a negative at the time, and perhaps, and I've been gone for 6 years or so. So I'm not sure if it's still welcomed, if it's still being utilized, and but it would be a great investigative story. So I'm going to mention it to my colleagues, my friends back in Birmingham. You guys need to check on that. Yeah. I have a professor you can interview. And but yeah. I just, you know, that story, that's very interesting. You know, that's not something that we would have thought of, I think, in that time frame when it was deployed. So yeah. Thank you for mentioning that.
No problem. Thank you for coming.
So may I just throw in an additional thought? Linda, you sort of provoked another thought in me, and that is, sometimes, you know, because you Jasmine, you sort of mentioned sort of those feedback loops, right? How data is being collected and it's used in certain types of decision making and predictive environments. And one of the concerns about such an undesirable feedback loop is this whole notion of predictive policing, right? And there's multiple systems. And do you see any link, or does your research point to that? Yeah.
So predictive policing is, again, about how can we categorize people and then like predict what they're going to get into and then deploy police to make an intervention before they get into the thing. Well, yeah, all different kinds of data. Like data about toxicity in the water in certain neighborhoods, data about you know, school and suspensions and absences, right? All of these being used to make predictions. And not just prediction about like how we can make that better, but about this is straight school to prison pipeline predictions. This is like how many more beds should we add to the prison, because we based on this data and how it's interpreted, we can make a prediction about who's going to go to jail, right? So predictive policing is using all different kinds of data to make inferences or predictions or place people in categories related to deviance or predicted deviance anyway. Yeah.